He has wiped out by his grace through faith in Christ your every sin, past, present, future.
Christian hedonist is somebody who says that my greatest joy, my greatest good is God. And therefore, I will pursue that joy and I will pursue that God above all else. So God's glorified and I'm satisfied.
You are now listening to the Pastor Discussions Podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 115 of the Pastor Discussions Podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Joan. This is your conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.
And we're part of the Bar Podcast Network. You can get more information about them and find some other great podcasts to listen to at thebarpodcast.com. And quick shout out to Joel Sedekase on the Think podcast, Think Institute. And I guess his brother Parker too. Parker's Penzies podcast.
What
P3.
A name. What a name.
That's a quintessentially Sedekase name for a podcast. And Joel was just at the Cruciform conference or something like that and gave a talk on Christians and discussing abortion that I'm working through right now. So far, it's been really good. So I don't know where you can find that if you're not friends with him on Facebook. I'll try to figure it out and let everybody know. But anyway, yeah, so let's just jump right into it because it's the end of October-ish. And we had the presidential debate last presidential debate.
Yeah.
And so what we wanted to do was kind of talk through, I think, what's been on a lot of people's minds, especially people that maybe were like me and had a big issue with voting for Trump in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're confronted with another nomination of Trump for re-election and Joe Biden, and trying to think through how do we process that? How do we think through? How do we steward our vote? What's our responsibility as Christians? Just kind of have a little bit of a dialogue about that as we lead up to this November 3rd. So, what are your thoughts?
This is always a hard topic.
Right?
And I think it's touchy, especially right now, just because it doesn't seem to matter what we're talking about.
Do we need to put a trigger alert sound on the?
We do need a button that has like sound effects. We can just press the button while we're going here. Actually, I think you should start. So, like, I wasn't in the same spot in 2016 that you were. So as somebody who had a dilemma in 2016, how, like, as a believer, so maybe let's not talk about
2020 yet.
And let's not start with political issues, because I think those bleed into like policies and things like that bleed into why it's important that we know those things as we steward our vote. But let's talk about, like, more from the Christian standpoint. Maybe where you were at, and then how you've gotten to where you're at now, based on
Christian,
like more the moral principles versus the policies.
Right. So I think that this is a good. I think that this is a good illustration of how many things in the Christian life are not as cut and dry and black and white and monolithic as we like to think they are.
I'd say that all the time.
I know. There are some things that are, there are, like, certain, for example, in this issue, certain policies like abortion, the sanctity of marriage, things like that. Those are, like, very black and white, cut and dry. For a Christian, you must be pro-life. There is a...
So you probably should define what you mean by that, I think.
What I mean by that is upholding the sanctity of life in opposing and wanting to abolish the murder of innocent people, both in the womb in nursing homes through euthanasia or things like that. Like, we're talking sanctity of life. We're talking the whole thing from conception to natural death, and preserving the sanctity of. So I would say that sanctity of life issues involve dealing with murder, how we address murder in our penal system, things like that. So it's broad, it's all encompassing, but you can't be you can't have certain stances that are morally in opposition to clearly articulated truths of the Bible. For example, all people bear God's image and have dignity, worth, and value, and should and their lives should be valued. You can't have a position that is in opposition to that. That's like a cut and dry type thing. Where it gets ambiguous is maybe how that's carried out. Right? So like, there are advocates of abolishing abortion altogether. There are advocates of using the lawmaking process to restrict access to abortion, and rather than just outright outlawing it, working through the system to work toward a pro-life stance over a longer period of time. Right? There's different approaches to these things. But what I'm saying is, when it comes to certain policy issues, there are clear black and white lines in the sand. So when it comes to how we vote, then, because there are different ways of getting there, that can be very challenging to think through. And so what I think this highlights, back to the original point that I was going to make, is this highlights the importance of Christians thinking through things with a biblical lens and a biblical worldview. And and I think I can speak for both of us, because we can both I think everybody can tend to get sucked into the political aspect of this, like the party lines and stuff like that. The challenge is thinking through these things from a biblical lens, a biblical perspective, a biblical worldview, and then arriving at certain conclusions based on that biblical worldview, and being open to that changing as you maybe get new information or think through things in a different way. So back in 2016, there were a few things that kept me from voting for Trump. Number one was his morals. He's a narcissistic.
Which that hasn't changed.
That hasn't changed. No, narcissistic, bombastic, morally reprehensible in relation to how he has treated women, and there's not an alternative, right? Like, so like there wasn't an alternative in 16. There wasn't. No. Yeah. And that's what I'm saying. So like, you kind of, in that issue, you're kind of like left in this hard spot where it's like, you got moral corruption on one side, and you got moral corruption on the other side. And that tends to be the space that we live in, when it comes to political issues in, America. So there was that, and that was a big thing. The second thing was, I honestly just didn't trust that he would have conservative policies. I thought this was another feeding his narcissism, trying to put another accomplishment on his belt type of thing. So I didn't vote for him for that reason as well, because I didn't trust that he would actually do what he said we do. And again, here we go. You got the same problem on both sides. So I ended up in 2016, I voted independent. I voted third party. I'm not comfortable with not voting. I think that's a responsibility that we have. And then you've got these other issues, like, does my vote, we're in Nebraska, does my vote really even matter? You get that a vote for third party is a vote for Hillary back in 2016, all these other things, right? So that was sort of where I was at. I had a moral opposition to the candidates on both sides for different reasons. And could not get on board with, and there's also the third thing, I think, is the dignity of the office. And that's not to say that hasn't been eroding in my lifetime, but there is a certain dignity, I think, to the office of President of the United States, especially when it comes to foreign policy and comes to dealing with other nations, where I was concerned about how that would play out. So that was where I was at in 2016. So where were you at? What was your process and thinking through that?
So I think what's going to come out is there's not a right and wrong answer, I don't think, in this. I mean, ultimately, I think there is one, but we came to different conclusions. And,
Right.
And in my opinion, I would, as a believer, I don't think my conscience wouldn't have been comfortable voting the way you did, in the same way your conscience wouldn't have been comfortable voting the way I did. Now, is there a right and wrong? Probably, but I don't think we're ever going to know that on this.
I think we can say in this case, in 2016, there was definitely a wrong, right? Like, I don't think that Christians can cast their vote for a platform, and maybe this will come out later in maybe where I've moved a little bit, but I don't think Christians can cast their vote for a platform that is going to actively pursue the murder of innocent people.
Right, but you still have third party that you can vote for.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. So
the reason I voted the way that I did was that, like, so I tend to be a one issue voter, and it's the issue you're talking about. Like, as long as we're going to legalize killing people, I'm going to vote against whatever party holds that up, and for whatever, not party, but whatever person holds that up, and whatever person says we need to try to get rid of this.
Yeah.
And so in my thinking, I kind of came to the conclusion that you were talking about right there, about a third party vote was a vote for, in my conscience, as I looked at it, was voting for the pro-choice person. Yeah. That's the conclusion I came to. And so in good conscience, I couldn't vote any other way except for the one that was pro-life. And I have a different stance on pro-life than you. I am completely pro-life except for medical emergencies. Like, that's my stance. And so and that was kind of what I was asking about, like, define that. I think there's room for debate on that process. But in general, Christians cannot be for abortion for anybody whenever they want, at any time they want, and giving no reason. So I think we should agree on that as believers. So that's why I voted the way I did. I still struggle with Trump. Like, last night, so we're recording Friday, and last night was the last debate, and he's always touting himself. He's always saying, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And while those things might be true, there's ways to say those things without coming across as it's all about me, about building up his own ego. And, like, he said he's the most non-racist president ever, and went on and on with these things. And those things, they still irritate me to today. Yeah. But at the same time, for me, I look into it. So going from 16 to now, I actually kind of look at things the same. And I actually think, so Trump himself, his character, I don't think has changed at all.
No.
He's the same. Yeah. He's the exact person that I thought he was.
Maybe it's amped up a bit.
But the amping up has been completely reactionary to things that have gone around him. And so while I don't excuse that in my brain, I just, like, okay, I can see why he's acting that way. But I think you have even more reason now, if you are a conservative thinker and you are concerned about things like abortion, or, conservative. So if we're really concerned about the sanctity of life, now I do think there's a blind spot overall, because I think the abortion issue is being used as leverage to garnish a type of person's vote. And I do think that there, in general, in conservative thinking, there's a blind spot to the injustices that do happen in our world. Although I think the media is like exasperating everything and saying everything's just way worse than in reality it is. And so the reaction can be, oh, things are fine. Right. And the reality is there are those things in our world, pockets in our society where those things really do happen. and there are injustices, and we as Christians should care about those injustices in the same way that we care about the injustice of abortion. And so I'm not negating that, but I think that you have more reason now, if you are a Christian, to vote for Trump than you had in 2016. One, he's ruled from a policy standpoint, as the president, everything that he has done policy-wise that's been enacted matches what he said he would do. Matches what he said he would do. And he's actually been conservative. Like one of the biggest holdups I had all the way to the end is like I don't really think he's conservative.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Like he's been a liberal his entire life. He's a liberal-minded thinking person. Why would I he's doing this, in my opinion, when I was looking at that, just to garnish votes? And I still think that's part of his ploy, is he talks about these things to garnish votes, but he's actually implemented policies that are conservative minded. And so that's one reason. The other reason is, and this was my concern last time around, is the Clinton was better about hiding what this has become very political. We're talking about, but she was really good, and the party was really good at hiding what their real agenda was. Yeah, the agenda is out on the floor now. They're not even hiding it.
That was one of the things that I was going to say. Sorry, finish your thought now.
So they're not even hiding it. So if you look at 16 and now 20, I actually think you have basically the same. You have the same. It's a different person, but you have the same candidate running on the same issues, talking about the same thing, trying to get to the same spot. Yeah. And it's just more evident now where they're trying to go than it was in 16. And that was my biggest concern in 16, along with, again, I tend to look at one issue, and if you're separated on that issue, it kind of doesn't matter the rest of it for me.
Not that those other issues are unimportant.
Right, but that's my priority. That's going to be my priority, because I believe you're killing people. Yeah. We have as a country legalized killing people, innocent people who haven't done anything wrong in our society.
Millions of preborns murdered for convenience.
So as long as we're going to legalize that, and as long as there's somebody that's going to say that this is okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to be against you. That's just the way it is. But if that wasn't enough for you, in 16, you've got that now again,
taken to dialed to 12.
Right.
I mean, it's now post-birth abortion,
and then you've got all the other issues out there as well. And there's a huge contrast. There's a huge void between these two ideologies and these two ways of which we're going about things. So to me, and I had shared a post earlier, I still believe Christians are called to vote, and they're called to vote their conscience. Mm-hmm. They're not primarily called to vote on the issues. That's a secondary thing. So you have to vote your conscience. Now, you have to understand issues to be able to vote your conscience. You have to understand how those issues interact with biblical mandates, things that are very clear in Scripture for us. And then when you start doing those two things, then you have to follow, okay, what do I believe is right? And I get it. People feel like they're in a hard place because many see the abortion issue being elevated, and then the race issue being devalued, and people are being inconsistent in elevating one and not elevating the other. And what they see is, well, you respect this life, but you don't respect these lives. And then we actually don't ever talk about, those are both issues that we should elevate, both of them. Mm-hmm. But we politicize everything, and then we get into our talking points, and we want to talk about one, and we say, well, we start just taking sides, right? Well, I identify with this group, or I identify with this group, and all that does is it destroys any ability to have an intelligible conversation about why this issue matters and why this issue matters as well.
Or how pervasive this issue is when compared to this issue.
Right. And that's the point is like when you try to have that conversation about why this one is prioritized to me over this one,
right?
You get called names and you say you're inconsistent. It's like, no, I think they're both issues, but for me, because this one,
and they're interrelated. If you care about Black lives, you're going to care about abortion because a significant number of the abortions that happen are happening in the Black community. And then you look at,
it's the same argument that pro-choicers have made against pro-lifers about that they don't care about all the orphans. And like some of their arguments are like, well, we're going to have so many more orphans. And like, that's not something that we should avoid talking about as Christians.
Yeah.
There is a problem. Like we have more churches in the United States than we have orphans.
Yeah.
Like if we think about that as Christians, every Christian should be seriously contemplating whether they should be foster parents or adopting kids. Part of our call as Christians is to take care of the widows and the orphans. It's the downcast that we're called to take care of.
And that's where it comes into like, this is not a monolithic thing. You can't just reduce it to, a party platform because there's lots of different factors that factor into that party platform. So while I would agree with the conservative or the Republican Party platform on pro-life issues and disagree with the Democratic Party platform on issues of abortion, I also think we need to be fair, and I think what you're saying is that this issue of abortion has become just a party platform for Republicans, and they're looking to change that whole thing through policy rather than individual, in this case Christians, being willing to put their feet to the road and make some sacrifices and do some things that are necessary in order to alleviate some of the contributing factors to this.
We say we want to abolish abortion, but we're not willing to take the steps that give the excuses to the people who hold up abortion. And some of those excuses are things that we're directly called by God to be one of the people on the front lines helping with those issues. And we don't. We talk all the time, conservative thinking people, about wanting smaller government, except in the case of things that we're not willing to step out to. One of the reasons we have such big government is because we haven't done our job as a church to take care of the poor and the downtrodden and the needy and the orphan and the widow. Well, that's why we have food stamps and we have welfare and we have the system that we have to take care of orphans.
And what's really interesting about that is as you look at that abdication of responsibility, which is very clear historically. I mean, you look at in Springfield, when we lived there was Mercy Hospital. And Mercy Hospital was started by a group of Catholic nuns however many years ago. And that's kind of how it went. You had hospitals, orphanages. I mean, George Mueller, all these people that were Christians that were actively pursuing meeting these needs in the community and whether it's healthcare or whether it's orphan care or taking care of the poor and needy in missions, I'm not talking about missions but like starting a mission in town to care for the homeless and the needy. That used to be a thing that happened. And then what's happened is as we've outsourced that to the government, that has become a foundation for the advancement of a radical socialist agenda. And now, if you are opposed to this socialist agenda, which is all done in the name of caring for the poor, you hate people, and you know what I mean? So there's an irony there that as we've dialed back in our responsibilities and taking those responsibilities seriously, that has become a tool for a godless system to be perpetuated and encouraged and even embraced by people who I think are ill-informed but well-meaning. Like, there are a bunch of poor people. We need to care for them. That's the attitude of a lot of, especially young people that are buying into socialism. And I'm like, yeah, I agree with you. It's just, how do we get there? And so as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, so there's there's an illustration that a certain pastor who shall remain nameless because apparently he's controversial, has, and it's like basically when it comes down to how you vote in most cases, you're either voting to drive off the cliff at 55 miles an hour, or you're voting to drive off the cliff at 35 miles an hour. And the difference is the voting for 35 miles an hour gives you more time to try to turn the car around, right? That's his illustration. So I'm not advocating that either party is genuine. I think that there's a lot of career politicians that are milking the system, and
the whole thing is corrupt.
It is. Yeah. Leading me to one of the reasons why I changed my mind, because that corruption is being exposed by somebody that's got absolutely nothing to lose. And yes, he's bombastic, and I'm not making excuses for that. And like you were saying, when he's touting his achievements and everything else, like I agree. The way I would much prefer Mike Pence in office to Donald Trump. But that's another reason why I'm voting for Trump, is because of Pence. Because I think Pence is actually performing a significant service to our country as vice president in advising and encouraging President Trump in the right direction. You look at Pence and how he interacts, and you look at Trump and how he interacts, and there's like this night and day difference. And I think some of that comes down to a lot of that comes down to Pence and his faith. That he's not shy about, and that seems to be genuine and consistent in his life, and especially in this public life, this very public life. But you also have the radical liberal media that's just been, I mean, Trump can't do anything right. He does anything that's good, and it's twisted. And I think that is exposing some of that agenda that's become very clear over the last 4 years, and the scope of how much influence and how much drive is pushing in that direction from a popular standpoint. And so I look at all of those things, and I look at the fact that he's done everything that he said he would do. I've looked at the fact that he's appointed 3 conservative judges, and especially with Amy Coney Barrett, who has a track record of voting based on the law, not based on her own party preference or policy preference, and is restoring the court to what it was intended to be, not a lawmaking entity, but a judicial entity. And all of these things, I'm looking at foreign policy, and I think we're safer now than we were 4 years ago. I think before the Rona was blown up and everything and politicized, that our economy was better, all of these things. And as you look at that, it is actually an act of loving your neighbor to promote those kinds of things. That's not excusing the blind spots and the failures and everything else. But what it is, in my mind, what I'm looking at is you've got the pro-life issue, you've got the religious liberty issue, and you've got the sanctity of marriage and some of these other issues that have sort of like, that are moving forward. The minority radical view that's being perpetuated, that I don't think is held by a lot of well-meaning Democrats, like traditional Democrats. I think it's radical even for them. And like, how do you combat that for the sake of my children and our grandchildren? And who is going to be the person that is going to follow through on what they're saying? And so from that standpoint, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, I think it's an act of love. In my opinion, it is an act of love now to vote for Trump, because he is who he is. That's not going to change. The damage that's been done by him has been done by him. From that standpoint. And what we've seen is we haven't alienated a whole bunch of people. We're actually started building some coalitions and some foreign policy stuff that's been really productive and helpful and good. And when it comes down to it, like, are my kids going to be free to worship? Are my kids going to have an economy that where it's not a socialist economy. That's kind of where I landed. It was kind of like, basically, all right, he's got 4 years or 3.5 years, three quarters years, whatever it is. He's done what he said he would do. I don't agree with every policy. I don't agree with his attitude. I still have the same reservations about his narcissism and all of that. But what he has done is fulfill most of the things that he said he would do. And so that's sort of where, and that in contrast to the left, which has been totally radicalized and is not even hiding the socialist agenda anymore, not even hiding the openly touting that after a child is born, it should be decided whether or not they live. That's wicked. That's evil. That's not, I mean, we can make an argument for late-term abortion being evil. We can make an argument for early-term abortion being evil, but it's just like, they're not even couching it in my body, my choice anymore. It's human life does not have value unless it's a political tool. And that's where I'm like, I can't, the damage that they're doing on that side is so radical and so antithetical to my faith and what I believe and what the Bible teaches, that I can't condone that. I can't, no matter what Trump's personality flaws and his moral character flaws in that area are.
So how would you, two things that I've heard pushback. I wouldn't push back because I think this requires people to think beyond the surface. Like that's what this comes down to. So many people are just surface thinkers or platform. Like, right. And,
I am a Democrat. I am a Republican.
Right. And so they line themselves up, with one or the other, and there's no room for anybody in this middle area. So two things. One, what do you say to the person who says that they're using these against people who hold them? So these issues that we prioritize are being used. They don't actually care about them, but they're using them to garnish a particular thought, so an evangelical vote in this instance. So
we're pawns.
So
we're voting
exactly.
base.
Yeah. So you've got that, and then what do you do then if you do care about the racial injustices that are happening now? I get it that we've been, and this is the mistake that I think that conservative thinking people make. We get bombarded in every place that we look on television or in the media, social media, like everywhere we look, they're pressing this systematic racism, right? And like if you enjoy watching sports, everything you watch has got BLM and racism, and we should affirm that ending racism is a good thing. Yeah. Okay. So how do you differentiate between, because that platform is being pushed and people are so tired of it. They're like, I'm just sick of that. I want that to end. Therefore I'm going to go over here.
Yeah. It's kind of like
because what's happening is you're getting polarized over here because you just want it to stop, that you actually don't engage and think about, okay, BLM's bad. The movement itself is bad. It's a Marxist movement. They were touting that until 2 months ago, right, when people were starting to push back. If you go look at, I'm not a big advocate of Mark Driscoll, but Mark Driscoll did a sermon on BLM, and he actually quoted from their website. He put the quote up about, and this quote is changed on their website because they like,
is it the anti-family quote?
It's we're against the nuclear family. Yep. We are trained Marxists. Yep. Like they affirmed being Marxists. That's what their movement at its base is trying to do. Yeah. So if you're fooled by everything else that's going on, then like BLM's an evil movement, right, at its core. Now, that's not saying that what the people in the movement are understand that that's what they're marching for or fighting for, but all of the evil things that we're seeing in society are part of, at its core, what BLM is about. Now, at the same time, many of the things that they've been attacking against and touting against, there's some validity to them. And what's happened is we're unwilling to even talk about the validity to some of those issues because we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater because the bathwater sucks.
Yeah, it's COVID became politicized and got blown out of proportion.
Exactly.
So now I'm a COVID denier.
Exactly.
As opposed to saying, well, no, it's a legitimate threat to a certain population. Let's deal with that. Let's develop policies that are reasonable and that take this seriously.
Let's actually talk about,
exactly,
as we learn about this thing, what the right approach is.
So let me start with the last one first. You're gonna have to probably remind me what the first one. The first one is platform, or using people as a voting
pawns,
tool,
like especially the evangelical, because so as Americans we don't want to be used, right?
Right. Yeah.
We don't want to just fall into a trap. At least most free thinking people. A lot of Christians, especially ones I've talked to, is like he's just using that. He doesn't actually care about it. He just wants their vote, and like I understand that, but I think you could use that excuse last time. I don't think you can use that excuse.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. For that one, what was, and this comes down to different approaches. So what was Trump's stated approach to dealing with the pro-life issue? It was to nominate pro-life judges. He's done that. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can argue that he's using the pro-life stance as a voting base because he's delivered on it. More so, I think, than any other quote unquote pro-life president has that has had the opportunity to nominate a judge in the past 20 years. So he has delivered on that piece. And the other thing that I would say in that is we ties into the BLM thing and everything else. Like, people need to be thinkers. People need to be informed thinkers. So what do we live under? We do not live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic. In a constitutional republic, there is limited federal government, and everything that is not designated as a federal power has been delegated to the states and local governments. That's the original founding of our country. That's what it's based on. And a democracy is different. A democracy says the majority wins. So in a democracy, the minority does not have a voice. In a constitutional republic, the minority does have a voice because there are maybe minority districts, liberal districts, that are able to elect a representative that will represent their interests and their beliefs in a body that is made up not of what the majority thinks, but of what a representation of the whole country thinks. So that's an important point. The second thing is, like, in this constitutional republic, it's designed so that a majority of the decision making and policy making should be at the state and local level, which I think is one of the things that Trump is pushing for in different areas. And so that means that as a thinking Christian, we get sucked into this idea that my vote for the president is the most important vote I'm going to cast. And I would argue that the vote for your representatives in Congress, your vote for your mayor and your vote for your governor, your vote for, I mean, we've seen this. Look at the coronavirus nonsense that's going on in Michigan and the little empress up there that's trying to run her little empire as governor. Like, despotism is happening in Michigan, and it's being perpetuated not at the federal level, but at the state level. She's ignoring the state Supreme Court that told her that her little dictates were illegal. What is the guard against that? The guard against that is voting for a new governor, right? So when it comes down to our stewarding our vote, we have to be thinking, we have to be informed, and that means you can't vote just on a party line, right? So that plays into how we think about BLM, how we think about these other things. So I can at the same time affirm that there are pockets of racism. We're going to use that term. I don't even like that term, racism, but there are pockets of discrimination based on ethnicity, based on gender, based on all of these other things, right? That happen in the United States. So when I've got a friend who's in California. He's a black gentleman. We were on a podcast together, and he was talking about getting pulled over, doing nothing wrong, just because he was black, right? So, okay, do we just say, well, no, that doesn't happen because BLM is evil? Like, I believe him. I think that that's a legitimate, real thing. He has experienced that. And I know this guy. So we don't ignore real things that are happening, but we also don't just like embrace wholesale a evil ideology that's trying to exploit those bad things that are happening. So BLM is doing the exact same thing and pandering to a base that the conservatives have done in pandering to a base. There's no distinction. It's just what their base is and what they're pandering to.
Agreed. And so I guess my point is, like, when you engage with that person, the call then is to ask them, to plead with them to come out of being in a group and to think outside of the group and to look at the issue for what it is and what's been done about it, or what has been proposed to be done about it. And then make your decision based on that.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem we have right now for people who are never Bidens or never Trumpers, or, I mean, because you've got all these groups now that everybody's touting, is like, you need to think issue by issue. You need to think about, what am I convicted of is the biggest issue.
And that is informed by biblical truth,
right?
And that's where there's a theological triage that happens in voting.
There has to be thinking people doing this. One of the things that I agree with is, so there's a church down in Texas that touts Trump as the savior of America, and then they parade Pence, and they turn their worship service into these political rally. And it's like, okay, support him, fine. That's not what we're called to do as Christians. Yeah. And what you do is you actually promote that if you're a Christian, you have to vote this way, and you have to ignore all the bad things, all the morally reprehensible things that this person has done. Like, he's your guy. That's not how we should think. He's not our guy. Now, I wouldn't say Biden's our guy. Like, Christ is our guy. And so as we sift through these issues, we actually have to think. We can't just line ourselves up. Well, this stream of people that I normally hang out with, they're over here. Therefore, I'll just go line up over there. It's the same thing with BLM. It's the same thing with COVID. It's the same thing with every issue that goes on in our lives. Amy Coney Barrett, same issue. Just because you're in this, generally thinking in this stream of people, doesn't mean that you can't come outside that and hear the information, go back to what should be your worldview, which is a biblical one, hopefully as a Christian, and then make your decision based on that and argue from that standpoint. Everything is over emotionalized, and what winds up happening is emotions overrule thinking and logic and actually talking things through. And we can't actually, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't use those emotions, but those emotions should be informed by truth and by thinking and by logically working through things. I am not a proponent of suppressing emotions and getting rid of emotions, but they need to be in their proper context. Yeah. And right now, nothing about what anybody says or does, or even if you look at the debate, both those guys were frustrated, were angry, they were driven by emotion for the most part. Like, Biden was just on his talking points. He didn't answer anything. Trump, he basically says nothing except talk about himself all the time. And so you have to actually go and look at his policies to see what he's actually done. And when you do that, you actually come away, okay, well, he doesn't say anything, but he actually does stuff like that as a thinking person.
Yeah.
Biden says a lot and he doesn't do anything. He's got a track record of that.
Yeah.
So,
and the other thing is that and I think this maybe plays into why the sort of the strategic approach that Trump has taken on some different things is he's exposing that. Like, you've been in for 42 years or 47 years or whatever. What have you accomplished in this? And this is where you have to be a reasonable thinking person to work through this stuff, because both sides are slinging mud and throwing shade.
So the temptation though, when you watch that, is to be emotionally responsive. So there's one up there that looks more controlled, that's actually talking more clearly, that's actually talking about things that pull at people's emotions and what they care about. And then you got another person up there talking about them himself for the most part.
Neither of them are speaking really coherently, by the way.
I agree. There's lots of stuff. But one actually
I get
tends
what you're
to
saying.
talk about policy and issues, and one tends to talk about his own accomplishments.
Or at least on a superficial level. Because
Right,
never
but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And when you talk like that on this superficial level, on the surface, if you're not thinking, you're drawn to one type. And what I'm saying is, if you have to think past that, you have to look past that, you have to be willing to do the work to actually get past the initial emotional response, which is what one side is actually counting on. They're like counting on, I want to pull you to this and distract you from everything that I haven't done and everything that's trying to be done around me. And no, that's not about that at all. Here, look at this. And the other side is trying to do it too.
I was going to say, I think it's
you have to be able to see through that and look at that as a believer. And so I'm not going to say you have to as a Christian. I think there's a right and a wrong vote. Like I have always thought that. But I'm not going to condemn somebody.
I think there might be multiple right votes. Right? So like, I think based on what we were talking about earlier with conscience and voting conscience, I think there can be multiple right votes, but I think that there's definitely, in at least in the last couple of elections, there's definitely a wrong vote. Right? Like, so when it comes, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, cause I think we need to leave that space for conscience, but some guys like Keller are taking that space for conscience way too far. I don't think a Christian can in good conscience vote for somebody that's going to advocate the convenience killing of babies. I just don't think, I mean, if somebody can show me some sort of like basis for where that's an acceptable Christian action, I'd be happy to hear it, but I just don't think you can. So I think that there are wrong votes. I think there might be multiple right votes. Okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. 'Cause I do think you have to leave room for conscience. You have to leave room for spiritual maturity in thinking through these things, because somebody's conscience that is a new believer is going to be different than somebody who's been a believer for a long time.
My view has changed. Right. Case in point.
I think where we live and the people we know, our experiences, all those things play into how we view the world and we make the decisions that we make. I think the biggest thing here, you should be a thinking voter. You should not just vote because the people you normally vote for are over here or over here. Like, what is Scripture clear on for believers? And so I think we should clearly be voting.
Yeah.
I think that's clear. And I think there's some certain things that are clear in Scripture. I think where it gets hazy is when you start talking about, okay, the sanctity of life across the board. You have to look through the information now because it's hard to find. To see and to just start prioritizing what's going to go first. And I just I don't see how anybody who affirms Christianity, who says they're a believer, who loves God, could look at our world and not prioritize, slaughtering by the millions every year legally. Like, the other things that we're talking about aren't legal, even though they're happening. And so
then we should be advocating for the legal system to do its job in those situations,
and to advocate for the ridding of corruption that's in that system.
Exactly. And that's where voting matters.
Right. At the same time that we can vote for someone who's trying to who has said he wants to overturn a law that we find reprehensible in Roe v. Wade. So it's not black and white. Like,
agreed.
That I think that's the biggest thing. And you need to think and you need to follow your conscience, not your emotions.
Yeah.
Like, don't
biblically informed conscience.
Yeah. Do not confuse your emotions for a biblically informed, spiritually discerned, conscious decision.
Yeah. And that's where I think the last thing I'll say is that voting and our political engagement as Christians is not divorced from theological triage. You're going to have to, we don't live in the new heavens and the new earth, right? We live in an imperfect world that's been damaged by sin, where there's corruption and there's sin and there's decay and there's all these other things, right? So you cannot vote in, and this is maybe something that's changed in my mind a little bit. I can't vote as if I live in a utopian society where I'm not going to have to triage things.
Right.
You're going to have to triage things. And that's not saying, and don't hear me say that means that these other things that maybe are on the lower on the triage are unimportant. They're important. But as a Christian, you have to think through the biblical worldview and biblical lens of what does God uphold as primary? What does God uphold as paramount? And some of them overlap, right? Injustice in the killing of minorities overlaps with the issue of abortion. So it's not simple. And at the end of the day, we've got to steward our vote. We're going to have to be responsible to God for how we vote. And so as long as our vote is informed by biblical principles being applied to life in a consistent theological triage, then I think we can stand before God and say, hey, like I did the best I could with what I was given. And so that's where the burden of thinking and praying and reasoning through and having biblical literacy, right?
This also ties back to things like what we've kind of been talking about for 6 months now, that every decision we make in life is a worship decision, including your vote.
Yeah.
So like if we start to grasp that worldview a little bit of I'm always worshiping, there's some weightiness to everything that we say, to everything that we do, to every decision we make. There's a weightiness to vote because I understand that I point to something as I vote. I understand as I point to somebody, as I engage in a conversation with someone about these issues, about the way I talk, about what I post on social media. All those things, through those things you're worshiping something.
Yeah.
And so if we start to grasp that piece and start to live that out, it actually informs us. It actually helps us to think deeper. It actually helps me to not just say, well, yeah, I'm going to vote for that because I'm red, or I'm going to vote for that because I'm blue.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, what does God have to say about this?
Exactly.
What am I going to say when I take this action to the people around me? Am I going to point to him, or am I going to point to something else? Though, that's the thinking that has to be done as we start to engage in these political conversations, and as we go to the voting places to cast our vote. You're worshiping as you do that. Yeah. So have that mindset and be careful.
And you're worshiping in an imperfect world. And that's right. But
if your goal in that is to, okay, I'm worshiping, then I can still do that imperfectly.
Exactly.
And maybe at points, like 4 years ago, I would do something different than I'm doing now.
Yeah.
Maybe that something I know now informs me of something I did 4, 8, or 20 years ago that I did wrong.
Yeah.
That's okay, because we grow as we walk through these things. Your job is to be worshiping in this moment, doing the best that you can with the information that you have, being driven by biblical truth, being driven by the indwellment of the Spirit and Him working through you. Submit to that.
And that's what I was saying. Like, like I'm worshiping in an imperfect world. So that means that in my act of worship, in casting my vote, neither of the options are going to be ideal, right? My hope is not in those options. And my hope is in the God who raises up kings and who brings kings down, who guides the heart of the king like a stream of water type of thing. My hope is in the return of Christ, where all of the injustices will be made right, where all of the sadness will come undone, where perfect justice will reign. My hope is not in that for this world and right now. And I think that's where a lot of evangelicals that have fallen onto this social Marxism bandwagon have failed. Because yes, there's injustice, but we're not like living in a situation where we're ever going to live without injustice in this life. So what does that mean? That means my act of worship is casting my vote for the best option to be able to honor God and to be able to point others to Him, to be able to uphold biblical principles in our society. And it's not going to be perfect in this life. So the only way to vote in good conscience is to be able to say those two things. Exactly. Like, am I honoring God in my vote, and am I pointing others to Him? And am I hoping in Him ultimately and not in some political system? So if you vote and you can honestly answer after thinking through those three things, yes, 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 then that's how you should vote. Exactly. Well, this has been a long episode, I think. Oh, yeah. That's all right. I think it's important for us to think through these things, especially like we've kind of held off on this. It's hard to talk about this because everything is so politically charged and people are wanting to argue with one another. Like I've said this a lot, and I've learned this a lot about myself, especially over the last 6 months, is we have to be able to stand, like we can believe what we believe, but we have to be able to stand in a spot where we can hear from the side that tends to side with the things that we believe, but from the other side, and be able to sift through that data and that information and see if it changes our mind. That is our call. And if we're grounded in what we believe, like scripturally, and what God's called us to do, we can be in that spot and not feel like we're going to get tossed to and fro. Yeah. Because we're still standing on the rock of truth. Hardly anyone's willing to do that right now. And so I think it's really hard to have these conversations because everybody's polarized. Everybody wants to say what they want to say. And it's so hard to even have, well, what about this? Yeah. And have them think through it and push back and let them do that to you and actually let it sift through your mind. Yeah. And I think it's just really hard. It is. And I think that there's and it's not just about this issue. It's just exasperated by the media. It's exasperated by the agenda of, I just think that I think that there's a lot of people that have legitimate things to talk about who vote Democrat, where your AOCs and your Schumers and all of these radicalized left people make it so that other people won't listen to them. Yeah. Because of the radical direction that they're going, that these other people might not agree with in all points. So anyway, yeah, good talk. So we'll find out. Yeah, that almost led into a whole nother episode right there. But yeah, so anyway, that's all we got for today. Great. Go forth and steward your vote well. Yeah. So, all right. Well, hopefully you will come back for another episode whenever it's on, and we'll be back then. So join us then for another discussion on. Man, I can't even end the episode right. For the next episode of the Pastor Discussions podcast, your conversation on doctrine and faith and the Christian life.